Example 4. In this next example, we're going to use only sine and cosine in order to simplify a complicated trig expression. So this means we're going to take all of our trig functions that we have and we're going to turn them into just sines and cosines. It's going to make simplifying much, much easier. So we have cosecant of theta times secant of theta minus cotangent of theta. All of this looks like a mess, and I don't want to deal with a mess. So I'm going to take cosecant, and cosecant becomes 1 over sine. And then secant becomes 1 over cosine minus, and then cotangent becomes cosine over sine. Now I know this looks bad. It looks like I'm making this worse, but it's going to make it better, I promise. So the next step is I'm going to write this out just a little cleaner. When you multiply two fractions, you just multiply across. So you get 1 over sine of theta times cosine theta minus cosine theta over sine theta. So now what I need to do is find common denominators. Here I have a sine and a cosine, and in the other fraction I only have sine. So I need to multiply my second term by cosine of theta over cosine theta. So I'm going to get 1 over sine theta cosine theta minus cosine squared theta over sine theta cosine theta. Now that they have common denominators, I can make them one fraction. So I get 1 minus cosine squared theta is all divided by sine of theta cosine theta. Now at this point, your brain should be jumping out and going like ding, 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 because right here we have a trig identity. So if you don't see it, I'm going to show you how to get it. So it kind of looks like, it's not exactly, but it kind of looks like sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. Now notice that I don't have the sine squared and I have 1 minus cosine squared. So I need to make a 1 minus cosine squared. So from both sides, I'm going to subtract cosine squared. And that's going to leave me with sine squared equals 1 minus cosine squared. Now notice that this matches that perfectly. So based off this, I can see that sine squared is equal to 1 minus cosine squared. So for my next step, 1 minus cosine squared is going to become sine squared theta, all divided by sine of theta over cosine theta. Now, the numerator literally means sine squared. So that means sine of theta times sine of theta, all divided by sine of theta times cosine theta. So then one of my sines is going to reduce off, and I'm left with sine of theta over cosine theta, and you're done. Now, if I wanted it as one trig term, if the question said reduce this down to one trig term, this is also equal to tangent of theta. So keep in mind, those are the same thing. However, but the problem asks for just sine and cosines. Okay, so now on your own, I want you to try this one. I want you to simplify secant minus tangent times sine and 1 over cosine times 1 minus sine squared, only using sines and cosines. All right, so here we go. Secant becomes 1 over cosine. Tangent is going to become sine of x over cosine x. And sine of x is just sine of x over 1. So now I'm just going to clean that up a little bit. And this is going to become 1 over cosine minus sine squared over cosine. I'm in luck. I already have common denominators, so that's good. So now I can just write them as one fraction. And I get 1 minus sine squared over cosine of x. And so I'm going to use my Pythagorean identity again. I'm going to go sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. But notice I have 1 minus sine squared now. So instead of minusing cosine like we did in the previous example, we're going to minus sine squared from both sides. And that's going to leave me with cosine squared equals 1 minus sine squared. So we're going to use this piece right here, 1 minus sine squared is equal to cosine squared. So notice I have the 1 minus sine squared here. So this 1 minus sine squared becomes cosine squared, all divided by cosine. And then one of these is going to reduce off. And so my final answer is just cosine of x. So for this next part, we're going to look at 1 over cosine times 1 minus sine squared of x. And this is actually not that bad at all because we already have the 1 minus sine squared of x. And in the previous example, we saw that 1 minus sine squared of x is cosine squared. So then you get this becomes cosine squared of x over cosine. One of them is going to reduce off, and you just get cosine of x as your answer.